So Barry, you've had an incredible career in science, in electrochemistry specifically, but I'd like to start by talking about early influences, what maybe got you started, and I'm talking about before college, early life experiences or people.
Well, actually, I never knew any scientists per se in my younger years. I sort of did a lot of reading and read some books like classics like Paul de Kruif about scientists, and those are the kind of things that intrigued me. And I always gravitated toward chemistry. I did the usual chemcraft experiments, and they were much more elaborate chemistry sets in those days than they permit today because of safety reasons. But basically, I didn't meet a professor until I went to college, really. So it was, and yet I still knew that chemistry was what I wanted to do at some early point. But it's very hard for me to point specific influences. Once I went to college and met a lot of people, then things happened that directed me where I eventually would go.
So undergraduate at Princeton.
Yes, I was very lucky in that my freshman advisor was Clark Bricker, who supervised theses of a few people who are involved in electrochemistry society over the years, and it was a very fruitful era at Princeton with Professor Furman and his group, Charlie Riley, Ralph Adams, and those people were just doing their PhD theses when I was an undergraduate. Wow. And having Clark Bricker direct me where I should go to get my directions was extremely helpful. And because the one thing that had been of utility to me science-wise was my high school graduation was in a January, at the end of January, something that they shortly got rid of, but it left me with 6 months to go before I went to Princeton, and I got a job in a laboratory, S.B. Pennick and Company, and I met a number of people in that laboratory who were not research types, but excellent laboratory chemists. And I learned a lot about technique and laboratory operations. So I had all this experience when I arrived at Princeton and talked to Professor Bricker. And so he gave me a maximum dose of chemistry, physics, and math. And not long after that, he actually sort of hired me to work in his lab and do some experiments that were supplemental to things that were going on. So I was then in the analytical labs, and where Riley, Cook, Adams, all those people were doing a lot of the early work in coulometry and other aspects of polarography, electrochemistry. And that had a great influence on me and sort of pointed me in that direction. So when the time came for me to move a couple of years later, Bricker pointed me to Walter Kausman, who's a very well-known physical chemist in protein chemistry, and also had a side interest in electrochemistry for my junior paper and senior thesis, and it was of interest Electrochemical Society-wise that Paul Milner was a graduate student of Kauzman's at the time, and so I met him at Princeton, actually, and then, of course, many years later was going to see him again for many, many years at Bell Labs and within the Electrochemical Society. As an aside, when my wife Sandra and I decided to get married in 1965, this is well on, this in my Bell Labs career, we asked Paul to be our witness because in Plainfield, New Jersey, where we were living at that moment, you had to have someone who knew you from a certain number of years before, and he was the only person at Bell Labs I had met before I went there, so he was our witness when we got our marriage license.
And I want to just, state for the record that, so Paul Milner, of course, was an ECS past president like yourself. And I think beyond that, like yourself, was such an influential person, for me as a
Yes.
early staff member young staff member at ECS, where the mentoring that I got was a lot of it came from this Bell Lab influence from people like Paul.
Dennis Turner, Paul Milner,
Right.
Bob Frankenthal, all as secretaries would have interacted strongly with you, of course.
That's right.
So yes, it was Bell Labs and the ECS were really strongly connected with several past presidents, and Bruce Hannay,
Yes.
who was a vice president and the director of research at Bell Labs, was one of those. And Paul certainly, in every way, gave his all for the Electrochemical Society.
We did a podcast interview with John Gershner, who wrote the book, The Invention
Yes.
Factory. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And that really, there was an exchange between us about, the whole Bell, well, of course, what was going on at Bell Labs and their success, and then the influence of Bell Labs. And I believe, now I have hindsight and having these conversations, reading the book, and when I think about it and that era, I think that ECS, was able to benefit from Bell Labs' success. It was ECS was essentially, feeling the momentum of what was going on because of the people at Bell Labs were influencing ECS, and I think it gave ECS a sort of a focus and led to a lot of the good things that the organization was doing.
Yes, I think that is certainly true, and it was characteristic of Bell Labs at that time that people had that opportunity to interact with outside organizations.
So you went to MIT after Princeton.
Yes.
You began to talk about that. So what was going on at MIT?
Well, when I graduated from Princeton, I had decided to go to Cambridge, Mass, either at Harvard or MIT, and it was a choice between Lynn Gaines' group. I had decided, because of the influence of the people at Princeton that I was referring to, like Ralph Adams, who was my lab instructor, and some meetings I had with Professor Furman and so on, that I would, and my time with Professor Kauzman, that I would go on in the field of something related to electrochemistry. So the option was Lynn Gaines' group at Harvard or MIT, which had a much larger group of graduate students. So I chose to go to MIT, and there was a large group there. David Hume, for whom I eventually did my thesis, who was a Kolthoff student, and Buck Rogers, Lockhart B. Rogers, who was known universally as Buck, had gotten his PhD at Princeton, and both of those professors had large groups, and there were several other people there at the time. So it was a very interesting place to work, and I thought that would be more interesting, more variety, and I think it turned out to be that way. I remember, for example, although I was in the chemistry area, Herb Eulig, who was extremely important in the history of Electrochemical Society in corrosion, used to have an electrochemical series of visiting speakers at MIT, and I attended all of those talks and heard from a lot of the most prominent people in the field. And I particularly remember there was a professor in the audience all the time. I didn't know who he was at that time, who would ask questions and always seemed to know more about the subject than the speakers did. And I finally found out that that was Carl Wagner, whose name didn't mean too much to me then, but certainly as I learned more about electrochemistry, he was a dominant name. So I worked in sort of classical areas of electrochemistry, and then got my PhD with David Hume, and moved up the street to Harvard for a 3-year instructorship in teaching analytical chemistry at Harvard. And at the conclusion of that, I met Bill Slichter, who was a director at Bell Labs and served at the liaison, as the liaison from Bell Labs to the Harvard Chemistry Department, and got interviews at Bell Labs, and joined Bell Labs in 1962, and eventually moved into the electrochemistry area, where I was sort of reunited with Paul Milner and a lot of other people, and all the atmosphere at the Bell Labs, which was a wonderful place to not only to work, but to be acquainted with virtually everything interesting that was going on in science. They managed to have people who were experts in almost anything, and collaboration was very much encouraged. So to do research there, you always had someone who knew the subject, or could make what you wanted, or wanted what you could make, and it was a very fertile atmosphere for doing research. When I got involved in the electrochemistry department, I was able to do research in things that I wanted to do, and as well serve as a resource for people, particularly in corrosion and some battery issues, to assist in processes at Western Electric, or solving problems and so on. So it was a sort of, for people like me there, it was a dual role in which we had the opportunity to do whatever research we wanted, essentially, and without having to struggle for funding and other things that dominate academic people's lives these days, and be useful as well to Western Electric, which was the manufacturing arm. And so our time was sort of paid for by AT&T's research money or Bell Labs specific case money for different projects. And it was a very nice way to work. So I can never complain that I didn't have the opportunity to do whatever I could at Bell Labs. I take, for example, and the Pine Instrument exhibit here, talking about the history of ring disc electrodes. For people who have attended this San Diego meeting in particular would recognize that that history was displayed, and I think it may have been at Electrochemical Society meetings or a Gordon conference that I met Stanley Bruckenstein. And I had early picked up on that series of papers of 1966 outlining the theory of the ring disc that he did with John Albury and other collaborators whom I met over the years. And I was beginning to use these tools in the study of metal corrosion, and I was building apparatus to do these experiments and had started to enlarge upon the technique in a sense of making a divided, a split ring electrode which would allow me to do certain experiments to detect unstable intermediates and identify things, or simultaneously electrochemically monitor multiple components of an alloy, for example. And we met and got together and got very interested. I had great collaboration with him over the years, and he would spend his summers at Bell Labs. And so we worked together and generated a long series of papers in that field. But that was also something that was very easy to do at Bell Labs, to arrange that kind of collaboration.
Right, but I was going to ask a question about that. So when you say spent his summers, how exactly was that arranged?
He actually moved down from Buffalo to New Jersey and stayed the summer, and we just worked together. It was like a every summer sabbatical kind of thing for him, and we just it was a very beneficial collaboration in all respects. And
Yeah, and I guess what I was thinking, what makes it feel unusual, at least to me, was that, you know, when you think of corporate research, right, and was he just invited in to, you know, join you in the labs?
I made a proposal that he would come, and we would work together in an area that I was already in. And I spoke to the possibilities of where we might go and how it might benefit things, and that was enough to generate it. And when he came, it was a very productive time. We generated a lot of papers together and new directions in the field. that I was later able to draw upon or extend in my own work when he wasn't there. And so they were very happy because the Bell Labs atmosphere at that time, not only were we trying to do things to help Western Electric or produce newer things for them, but also they were very sensitive to doing research and improve their image in the world. So anything that was really productive or useful in the world of science was fair game. And that was the kind of thing that made Bell Labs attractive to all kinds of people
Right.
who wanted to do research. And there was, if I were to compare, if I jump on when I left Bell Labs and went into academia again at Case Western Reserve University, to compare doing research in the atmosphere of Bell Labs and in the university. Bell Labs at the time in the glory days before the Bell system was going to be broken up, and Bell Labs, as we knew it then, was going to effectively disappear. As you may have gathered from your discussion with that author.
Yeah, John Gershner. Right.
I read that book, and he didn't discuss the areas of Bell Labs that I was particularly involved with, but the gist of that book and the trend of the loss of Bell Labs was, I think, a great loss for the United States science as a whole. However, getting off that subject a little bit, I would say that the change did not slow change in the United States in terms of innovation. It just changed the model of where it was going to be done and how it was going to be done. Back in those days, taking the telephone system and what we have now in mobile communications and companies like Apple and Samsung producing things. In those days, Bell Labs designed, Western Electric manufactured, and effectively AT&T distributed to everyone. And there were very few options consumer-wise. There was Ma Bell, and everybody used Ma Bell, and 1 million people worked one way or another for the telephone company, and that dominated things. Now I think the situation is totally reversed. We're consumer-oriented, and everybody has options of where to go and what to choose. And so the whole world is very different from the model of Bell Labs and the kind of research support that AT&T provided to Bell Laboratories.
But there's an interesting connection. This is some of the exchange that we had with the author of the book. So I mean, the first thing is that, while yes, there was antitrust issues and monopolistic control of, the phone business, but what it was enabling then for a company to be able to make such large investments in research, and not only make those investments, but as you were alluding to, there was a deal with the patents, so the information was available.
Yes,
there was
everything had to be freely available,
right.
and it was a monopoly in the sense of the telephone system, but it was not a monopoly in terms of ideas.
Right.
Basically, when the transistor was invented, which turned the world over in a lot of ways, it was freely available
Right.
to everyone else. So the products of all that research did not go into profits for AT&T. There are a lot of, I think, things that led to change, and Bell Labs and AT&T were never immune to making bad decisions as well as good ones that actually affected me personally in what I was doing. There were activities, for example, in microwave communication, that they wanted to use these long tubes of steel lined with copper and polyethylene as microwave with millimeter wave guides, and when optical fibers came in, all that effort that we did in successfully creating this bit of technology went by the wayside because that, and they were very slow in switching from an analog world to a digital world, and so on. So the system was not immune to making bad decisions as well as creating a lot of good things, and you know, I spent a lot of time on several projects like that that were dead ends in terms of technology, and the Bell system had to play catch up in lots of things like optical fibers because Corning was there first. But when they had to play catch up, they were able to throw a lot of resources at the problem and really solved it very well.
They had the brain power to do it. Do you want to share some additional things about the liquid junction solar cells, which is one of
yes. As far as a topic of research, semiconductor photoelectrochemistry, I think, is the most interesting area I've ever been involved in as far as a scientific issue, and I was able to use all of the kinds of things I had developed over the years in that, and so it really dominated a lot of my attention over the years. But the way I got involved in that was Adam Heller had come to Bell Labs from GTE, and we got to discussing various things at that time. And in 1975, Heinz Gerrischer published a paper outlining the basis of a liquid junction solar cell, semiconductor electrolyte solar cell. But at the time, no one had produced one of any stability or a working example. And so in our discussing it with Adam, he was greatly influenced by this paper and the possibilities, which was typical of him.
Adam Heller, another one of the famous Bell Labs.
Vision. I always talk about the Adam Heller question. If you're considering doing research, the question you should ask is, if you succeed beyond your wildest dreams in what you're attempting to do, what would you have accomplished? And he had a very sure feeling for areas in which that answer would be strongly positive. And solar energy was one of them. The cost factor at the time was perhaps, solar cells were perhaps 100 times more costly than conventional ways of generating power. That situation has been virtually completely reversed today, and solar energy is competitive. But at the time, all bets were open as far as other ways of doing it. And when these liquid junction cells were sort of proposed, particularly in that Gerischer paper, Adam and I had long discussions about how one could make a practical one. And I suggested that if we made cadmium sulfide by an electrolytic method, that it would be stable in a solution of sulfide, and we could utilize the junction to carry out a cell in the mode as outlined in the Gerischer paper. And we did that work, and it was published in 1976, and simultaneously two other laboratories in the world, Wrighton's lab at MIT and the lab of Manassan, Hodis, and Kayan at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. We all used basically the same system, coming at it from different reasoning, but that was the period in which we all demonstrated that a liquid junction cell was possible to make. And Adam and I went on from there and made very efficient cells with 2,6 compounds and gallium arsenide, indium phosphide, and that work got a lot of publicity and interest at the time. Of course, I would have to say I don't believe any liquid junction cell will ever be able to compete with a completely solid state system. We could perhaps match things like efficiency and economy, but the stability of such cells remains open and questioned. You can buy silicon solar cells that you might expect to work 20 years or more, but you certainly couldn't expect that from these liquid junction cells. So it was a very interesting period, and it led to a lot of knowledge about these junctions and other possibilities related to hydrogen generation, which may at some point be practical with these kinds of systems. But it was a particularly fruitful era for me, because all the tools that I had worked on electrochemically were beautifully suited to studying the problems in this area. So I've continued throughout my career to work in related areas to that. It's the most interesting problem in terms of coupling solid state and electrochemical science, just the realm of the electrochemical society together in one system, materials dominated, electrochemistry dominated. It was beautiful as far as a scientific problem. So it's fascinated me ever since.
Well, and you started to get us up to date on some of your research and some of the things that are happening. And so I want to read a question to you so I get the answer I'm looking for. Your more recent research is focused on some interesting aspects of photoelectrochemistry, where you're looking at solar to electric energy conversion, renewable fuels, removing pollutants, and even addressing long-term energy concerns. Tell us about some of that work and why you think it's so important.
Well, that all started with this first set of experiments that I did with Adam, and over the years, that kind of research also uncovered what the limitations of this interface between a semiconductor and a redox system would entail, and what many of the problems are in getting a long-term system that would either generate power or make products directly by using the energy of the sun. Some of these things can be done by coupling a solar cell of a solid kind, like silicon solar cells, and electrochemistry to use the energy of the sun. But in certain cases, there may be specific advantages of having this all done in one single system, mainly to make fuels or to directly generate energy. So my attention research-wise was devoted to studying the aspects of photocorrosion, what happens to these semiconductors that may cause the systems to fail over certain times. And as I was involved over the years with things from semiconductors, superconductors, diamond electrochemistry, I always went back to studying some of these problems, particularly of stability, which is the limitation of these things, as many more things can happen at a solid liquid interface than can happen in a solid state cell where only charges move around. In a liquid junction cell, chemistry itself must happen at both electrodes in order to pass current, and it's this kind of thing that is the limitation. For example, when we developed a gallium arsenide cell, we actually developed one that was 99.99% efficient with respect to the reaction we wanted, but that 0.01% meant that in a year you would lose 25 microns of the semiconductor, which meant that being able to use very thin films, which were the limitation, which were the advantage, I should say, of these kind of cells, would still be a problem, even if you could get nearly perfect. So it was, I wasn't attempting to, mostly in my own research, to create better cells in terms of something that society would be grabbing, but understanding the chemistry and limitations of these systems. And later on with diamond films or other things, using those as protective layers, for example, in solar cells, and seeing what the possibilities were.
And on this path, now you've mentioned any number of people, great scientists and influences at ECS, actually, not in just electrochemistry, but here. And so I want to turn it in that direction now a little bit about ECS. So, and tee it up by saying, first that your experience with us is one of the rare ones in that you've held the two most senior positions in the organization, which are the editor of the Journal of the Electrochemical Society and, of course, president. I mean, you've done many, many other things, symposium organizer, been on the board, chairman of a division, and so on. But you've had these very significant leadership positions, and it makes you very unique in this organization, and had a great deal of influence on the evolution of the society. So maybe the easiest thing would be just to ask you, open-ended question. How about a few highlights from your experiences in these leadership positions?
Well, I remember very clearly my first Electrochemical Society experience. I didn't know all that much about the society, but I attended my first meeting to give a paper on copper etching, as it was, in 1965 in Toronto. And I very much enjoyed the meeting, and I got to meet a lot of people there that were just names on papers to me. Over the years, the Electrochemical Society, forgetting the activities within the society, I'm just talking about meetings, which were very central in my career. Got to talk to people, to exchange information, and this to me has always been one of the central functions of the society, to provide this venue that both in meetings and papers really advances a field. And so I was very happy thereafter to attend meetings, and but the thing that got me initially involved in the society itself was in 1974. My colleague Jim McIntyre and Stanley Bruckenstein were large factors in the physical electrochemistry division. They were officers, the board of the division, and so on. And Manfred Breiter had moved from General Electric back to Germany, and he was a divisional editor of the society, and they asked me to take over his slot. So they effectively nominated me to Norman Hackerman, as sort of the process was then of how people were chosen for divisional editors. And that was really my entry into the society through the journal, and then being active in the physical electrochemistry division. So I eventually became an officer in physical electrochemistry, and then as you get more active, you take greater part in activities of society, and the most significant one in those years for me, in terms of my activities from then on in the society, was in the mid-'80s, Dennis Turner headed a long-range planning committee of the society. And as part of that activity, he assigned publications, since I had experience, to Larry Faulkner and myself. And now I come to the society and the journal, and the long history of the journal under Norman Hackerman. He served as editor for 38 years up to 1990. And I think for 10 years before that, he was really the technical editor or scientific mind behind the journal. But I knew from my, by then, fairly extensive experience as a divisional editor in physical electrochemistry and analytical electrochemistry, that things were not all well with the journal in terms of the process of papers coming in, lag time, time to publication, and the mechanics of the journal. And Larry and I were much concerned about this issue. And it was at that time very difficult to conceive of a change because Norman Hackerman had been there so long, had done an outstanding job for the society over many decades. Mm-hmm. He was a president of 2 universities, Rice and Texas, and so on. But by that time,
No, wait. So where you're going with this, of course, is a man of this stature and experience, and you and Larry Faulkner are about to tell him or write a report, I suppose, that suggests we do it a different way, right?
Yes. That was our way out, in effect. What had happened to the journal was it was a two-headed being at the time. It had an office at Rice University where Norman Hackerman was, and the staff under Sally Kilfoyle in Pennington. And it was a very awkward transition of papers and mechanics and so on. And on top of this, the operation of the journal had grown so that we had, at that time, 90 divisional editors, which in a way is very nice. It involves a large fraction of the society in the process of creating this journal, which was very important to everyone in the society. But on the other hand, 90 people had to work well in order for the process to be successful, and some of that was breaking down. So Larry and I wrote this report in which we suggested changing the structure of the journal to an editor and 6 associate editors who would handle a lot more papers, but would have much greater control and interaction with Pennington and the editor, and hopefully carry out the process more efficiently. Well, Norman Hackerman, of course, did not want to be involved in any transition like this, and so it became necessary for, when this was approved and went through all the processes of approval within the society, it had to get done. And at the same time, Larry was advancing to being president of the society, and he asked me to do the editor job. And that went through society, and then all the selecting of 6 associate editors and so on, the whole process. And so I had that responsibility. And the initial year of change in the system was rather difficult and awkward because we had to, there was a lot of resistance from the old system. A lot of divisional editors liked their jobs, pretty much. And many of them actively protested this transition. So there was that aspect of it. And then with 90 people, we had several where manuscripts had disappeared. they simply hadn't carried out their function. I'll put it that way. And so the transition in the process involved a lot of change. I remember I would make weekly visits to Pennington for most of my 5 years as editor to make sure that everything was moving properly. And I think we accomplished that. We knocked off the lag time very quickly to something more efficient. And although there have been a number of changes in detail, I think that's basically the kind of system we're using today. It was a very interesting experience to me. Actually, it basically ended in 1994, I guess, when I was chosen to be a vice presidential candidate and then won that election. It was decided that the editor could not be in sort of oversight of himself and simultaneously be an officer's society. So I gave that up and it transitioned to Paul Cole. But that was a very interesting and productive period, and one I felt very satisfied with, because we did carry out a change in a way I think that was led to a improvement in the processes of production of a journal.
I'll give you the statistics. So you, in a reasonably short period of time, you took 3 months off the lag time. And this was a paper era. It was a different era.
Improvement, but it was a slow process in converting over, finding all these missing papers, and trying to keep authors happy. I think the process has changed a little bit. When we first used this system, the editor was still directly involved in selecting all the assignments of papers, and being a buck stops here kind of editor, in that anyone who had complaints about their papers, which was luckily only a very tiny fraction of papers that we handled, would go directly to the editor. And I think a lot of those things have changed. The technical editors have much more responsibility directly. Everybody who had an accepted paper at that time in 1990, 1995 received a letter from the editor. Now I think things go through the technical editors and so on. But it's basically an evolution of the same system. And then, continuing with publications, when I became an officer, was involved in that change. There were two other publication issues that come up: the creation of Interface and the Letters Journal. The Letters Journal was a much more controversial time in the society. When I think the final steps were taken when I was president, and it was not universally accepted that we could do all these things like a fast publication journal along with our regular journal. We had attempted over the years to have accelerated brief communications within the journal, but it was not a very successful way of doing things. and the way communication and journals were evolving, the society needed some mode of faster publication in order to be competitive with all the new journals that started appearing. The world was, in many respects, changing, and there was some evolution that we had to do in order to meet the needs of the time, and that particularly involved some investment. And I remember with some chagrin that it got so heated that my treasurer resigned, and so we had some conflict within the society because he thought I was pushing this change too quickly for our financial stability. But I have no regrets in what happened in the evolution of a letters journal and the path as it has evolved to really a faster publication, taking advantage of electronics, doing away with paper, etc., and meeting the standards of publication today. But that was one of the major issues when I was an officer and president.
What are some other highlights, interesting moments?
Well, as far as my serving as an officer of the society, I think there were a couple things I take particular pleasure in. And that when I was president, I helped start and speak at the initial meetings of the South Korea section of the society and the Israel section of society, and those were very significant to me, and I think have been very positive in the growth of society internationally. And speaking of internationally, preparing for our first meeting in Paris occupied me for 4 years, being vice president and president. And that story, as far as I'm concerned, begins earlier. I also served as the general secretary of the International Society for Electrochemistry in the United States in the period, I think, 1989, 1991. And in that function, I attended ISE meeting in Montreux, France, around 1990. And the issue came up of any potential interactions of ISE and Electrochemical Society. And from what I heard during that meeting, I will simply say I never believed that any joint meeting of the two organizations was possible, because there was a lot of resentment against ECS in that organization, and sort of, that idea faded from my mind. But somehow Larry Faulkner, who has a genius for operating in organizations and getting things done, served as president of ISE as well as the Electrochemical Society, and he created a document that they accepted that outlined the structure of a meeting of the two societies. And that scheduled the meeting for 1997, I believe, in Paris. And it was at the same time I became the third vice president of the society, but the meeting schedule was such that I would be president during that meeting, so that the creation of the structure of that meeting was given to me as my responsibility right from the get-go of my becoming an officer. And so I interacted with you and Brian Rounsfield, who was very good at those things, and laying the groundwork within the society for that meeting. And it turned out to be a lot more difficult than I would have thought because of meeting constraints. I remember particularly we could only have 17 parallel sessions,
Right.
and the meeting was going to be so large that was felt to be very confining for a lot of the divisions, and I would go to the symposium subcommittees and take a lot of guff from certain people because they felt restricted by the structure of society, but it was a thing we had to live with, and eventually all was settled. And I think it was a very successful step for society, and certainly one which we have followed up on since. And I hope our international interactions continue. But that was a dominant issue for me during the period I was an officer.
And I just want to say about that too. It was, so the program was phenomenally successful. I mean, to that time, it was the most successful meeting we ever had. I felt that from a technical standpoint, the interaction created a marvelous program. So in the end, we struggled politically, maybe.
Yes,
and you took all the bullets.
Technically, it was beautiful.
Because you just said, too, our side was unhappy with you, and their side wasn't.
Yes,
nobody was happy about anything we were doing, except we were creating a great meeting.
There were financial issues, of course, that ISE did not want to risk any money.
Right.
And we were the bankers for the meeting and made all the profits, which turned out to be very positive. So that was another issue that success is not always so simple to live with.
No, it's not, and they're being disturbed about that. Is understandable because of the meeting being so successful. But with Larry negotiating this on the front end, it was very clear that what we were taking on was something that we don't, the cost of doing that meeting
we didn't know what
was
the degree of risk was, and so we accepted the total risk, and therefore the total reward.
Right, and so we got to the end of it,
yes.
and we said, well, that was the deal, and so, but I think that, and want to make this the point, you said it, I said it, is that together we did create a really fantastic meeting, a benchmark meeting, and that benchmark then led to ECS's ability really to navigate better on an international scale.
Also, there are sort of 3 25-year events occurring right now in San Diego, and your service with the Society, 25 years, and Interface becoming 25 years old, and the nanocarbon division, which was another story, but
right.
one I'm very happy with my role in. And Interface was interesting because there were rumblings over the years that we needed to communicate with the membership in a different way, and why don't we have some kind of magazine that other societies had successfully propagated that was both a popularizer in the sense of the kind of things that we were doing and information for our membership. And I was involved with helping that along, and Carrie Hansen at Bell Labs took on the responsibility, and we created this quarterly as a model, test model of what Interface would turn out to be. And I remember even the meeting that we had. I think there was a committee chosen to select the title of the magazine, and as I remember, Marcin Maida of the University of California, Berkeley, made a suggestion at that meeting of interface, and that caught on, and that became the title of the journal. But I think interface has had a very nice function over the years, and that again occurred during the period that I was involved in. It was very, very satisfying part of my interaction with the society.
Mm-hmm. Since we're getting close to the end, I want to just get your perspective about the society today.
I have been very impressed that the society remains a premier venue for the exchange of scientific and technical information and advancement, that the society has been carrying out its stated objectives in the world and has managed to survive in a very, very competitive environment. I think the society has continued to serve very well the function for which it was created. And it pleases me to look upon it, and that this tremendous transition that is in publication that we're attempting now is a very positive response to the way the world is evolving, and I think we're keeping up with the flow. So I can only wish it well.
Well, and thank you for that. And thank you for this today. Your story is one of the great stories, both inside the ECS and of course in the science that we serve. So really appreciate your sharing this with us today.
Thank you.